Hey guys, it's your favorite aspiring disability scholar, and it is still July, so I wanted to talk about today is a composite model of disability possible? Now, I've talked about this in my previous videos, but just in case, I'm gonna go over them. There are typically, when we talk about the way society views disability, three main ways of looking at it. The first model, and probably one of the earliest ones to be developed, just like in society generally, is what we call the tragic model of disability, which is basically just the view that disability is a tragedy and it should be met with charity and pity, and that disabled people essentially usually will never amount to much, and that um they should be treated extremely differently than other people. um And to be honest, like, this is one that obviously has its issues. Um, because obviously disabled people can do way more than, whatever some religious book says. And this model kind of comes directly from Christianity, more or less, where, like, in Greco-Roman society before Christianity, it was ultimately directly in the discretion of the father of a Greco-Roman family to decide um what would happen to a child, male or female. And usually if the male had some sort of disability or whatever, unless they were high ranking um in, like, society, but even sometimes, even so, like, they would just be exposed or be unalived, guys. And that was considered completely normal and within the rights of a man, of a father, to do. um and it's kind of weird because the tragic model kind of gave women more autonomy by essentially saying, okay, no, everyone is equal in the eyes of God and deserves a shot. And it took power away from men, which I've talked about um here before, and it's one of the reasons why I like the three Marys so much, because without their belief at the tomb, ultimately, like, I'm not a Christian, I don't believe in the resurrection, but their belief still eventually led that change and led women to have the choice to say, no, I want to keep this disabled person. But like I said, um for example, Claudius very famously had neurological issues. His speech was kind of slurred like mine, and um, I've read that some people think he had a cerebral palsy like condition, which is what I have, and which is based because he was Roman emperor. But, like, it also heavily depended on class. But anyway, the tragic model still, again, it was based around pity and stuff like that. And the next one is the medical model. Now, I kind of have a hard time exactly pinpointing when this one developed, because some forms of rehabilitation have always been around, or like medical modification for disabilities and stuff like that. So it's kind of hard to say what counts, but usually when people talk about the medical model of disability, they're just talking about the view that, oh, disabilities need to be fixed, right? And that um it's bad to not do anything medically about the disability, right? Or not to look for a permanent fix specifically, and like do rehabilitation and stuff like that. And in the modern sense, the medical model is based around the modern hospital and uh psychiatric and psychological institutions that we have, based around uh science and stuff like that, and the scientific method. um and its primary problem is that it assumes that disability isn't just a part of human diversity, and it's something that must be fixed and like permanently dealt with in some way. This was a very hard driving force in the eugenics movement, especially in the USA and Germany in the early 19 to mid 1900s. We all know how that ended up, and a lot of people don't know this, but a lot of the first victims of what would eventually come out of the a certain German regime of the 1930s and 1940s were disabled people. They called it Action Tefir, or Tefia, I think is how you pronounce it. And yeah, they euthanized disabled people because they called them life unworthy of life. Um and then finally we get to what we call the social model, which says that no, it's actually more so society that disables people, right? Essentially, that people with um different brains or different bodies, uh it's society that holds them back, essentially, through the way they're treated through the other two models. And so therefore society has a responsibility to like provide reasonable accommodations and um stuff like that in public and even in a lot of private spaces for disabled people to access. And like, you have handicap parking spots, ramps, automatic doors, stuff like that. That's those sorts of changes, and also their accompanying legal recognition um are a part of the social model of disability. And interestingly enough, the United States also pioneered this approach through its many activists, especially Brad Lomax of the Black Panthers and Judy Heumann of, well, the disability rights movement, and Ed Roberts and all those people. Um, and yeah, so how can we create a composite model of disability then? Well, if you'll notice, each of these models has some grain of truth to them, right? So, like, for example, although I don't think tragedy should be the main focus of a disabled person. I've talked about that. I think they should love themselves as they are. There is, especially for those that acquire their disabilities later in life, rather than like me, for example, that I've had cerebral palsy all my life. It's been all that I've known. Um, there is a sort of tragic element to that in the sense that you're losing ability which you once had, right? Which you don't anymore. Like think about a person that gets into an accident and becomes some form of spinal cord injury, quadriplegic or paraplegic or whatever, right? That comes with a significant um change in lifestyle, and it's hard for a lot of people, and acknowledging tragedy in that sense is useful. And that ties into the medical model as well, because like rehab is still important, and it's still important to experiment to know what your limits are in terms of doing better, not so that you can quote unquote fix yourself in the way that doctors would want us to be, right? But in the way of more so accepting and doing as much as you can by yourself with the help of a community, hopefully. I know, especially in the West, you disabled people don't usually get that, and that's actually one of the other limits of the medical model, right? It's like super against help and stuff like that, because there is a limit to what a person, any person can do, and they're gonna need help eventually. um And then the social model, of course, which says that, like, yeah, we should probably have laws protecting disabled people against discrimination and having some form of access legally required in the environment. Most disabled people um agree with that. Most able-bodied people, even I would say, and neurotypical agree with that. So how would I describe a composite model? I would describe the composite model as one which acknowledges the hardships of not being able or losing some part of you which you once had or won't ever have, because sometimes biological realities unfortunately get in the way, and that is tragic in some sense, and we should allow people to mourn that and not get into toxic positivity. And like the medical model says, we should try to do the best we can to rehabilitate ourselves to a level where we'll need the least, hopefully, the least or at least our limits of help that we'll need, and be able to determine that and think about that with uh the experiences of um medical professionals, despite the flaws of us, of them wanting to fix us rather than help us integrate more into society. And then the social model, of course, says that once we do all of the stuff that I previously mentioned, we should be treated as equals before the law and before society, and we should reasonably expect some help from that society to make the environment around us okay for us. And, I think that's a great model for disability that acknowledges the complex humans that we are. It doesn't fall into either pity or the view that we're irredeemable or that we have to be an inspiration. When you look at what I feel is a composite model of disability, it really paves the way for us to look at ourselves in a nuanced way. Because I do think that disabled people struggle with their selves and constructing a narrative, and I think, thinking about disability in this composite way uh can really help with that and help us like come to accept ourselves more. Because the problem with, in my opinion, current scholarship is that, at least when I learned about it, it could be different now because that was 4 or 5 years ago. So, but when I learned about it, they sort of talked about these models of disability as if they were like discrete and like as if they had solid or concrete start points and end points. But, I sort of like to think that each of these three models um focus on three aspects of disability and disabled life, but putting them all together, um you get to see more of what disabled life is really about. Obviously, a model is just that, a model. It doesn't fully capture anything. But I do think that um we as disabled people should start thinking in this more holistic way about these models, and that it should inform any sort of activism or change that we might want in the society. Okay, thank you very much. Bye.